Here it comes. Yeah, run. Oh, that hit the wicket. Oh, there. Quickly, run. You're out.
Great excitement reigned in our village when Gabriel Gold arrived at the Rose.
He was a great story reader. He would go into the dining room and sit in his chair, which is next to the fire. And I'd run in, having had my bath, and Richard would come along as well. I'd sit on his knee and he'd read stories. He had a beautiful voice.
Then the pirates drew.
I can still hear his voice in those stories now.
He flew after him. He did. And he flew as far as the eye could see into the horizon and disappeared.
Well, fathers don't tell their sons very much about what they did in their youth, and sons don't ask their dads. I've actually got butterflies in my stomach because I'm not sure what I'm going to see and how it's going to turn out. My father Burton was a huge influence on me. It was because of him that I became a winemaker. I couldn't have done it without him. But there are large areas of his life that are shrouded in mystery. And at this stage of my life, I want to find out the true story. My family have been involved with wine for 6 generations. My great-great-grandfather, Richard Hamilton, was a tailor by day, but by night he was in the wine trade, moonlighting, you might call it. The French made it, and my ancestor smuggled it in. It was a profitable little sideline, but the authorities were sniffing around, and soon Richard felt the time had come to pack up and sail to a place with more opportunity. South Australia. I'm Richard Hamilton, and I'm a member of the 5th generation of the Hamilton wine family. I'm the great-great-grandson of Richard Hamilton, who planted the first vines in South Australia by the River Sturt in 1838. Exploring the great Hamilton wine heritage has been a passion of mine ever since I can remember. In its heyday, Hamilton's Ewell at Marion was the 6th largest wine company in Australia, producing over 1 million cases of wines and spirits a year. But the family company's fortunes hit a low point when it was closed down in 1979. From the ashes of Hamilton's Ewell wines, and with the help of my dad and my uncle Sydney, I've managed to resurrect the family tradition with my wineries in McLaren Vale and Coonawarra. What part did my father Burton Hamilton play in the later unfolding family narrative? He was born in a vineyard and he died in a vineyard. He was an integral part of the Hamilton wine line, a quiet, modest man, and as a result, his story hasn't been told. And his early years are shrouded in mystery. Like I can see his silhouette through a mist, and I'm staring in vain to make him out. I want him to come out of that mist, become more real. That's the entrance to the cellar, so follow me. Go through it, just take it carefully as you come out. Remnants of the Hamilton Ewell winery are still to be found at the old company site in Marion. This cold fermentation cellar is a remarkable survivor. This is the old family home at the same location. It was built by Henry Hamilton in 1854. My grandfather Frank and his family moved in later. My father Burton was born here at Yule in 1904.
Hamilton crest.
Picture of Frank.
Picture of Frank.
Yeah, our grandfather. You can see a definite likeness.
So certainly got those Hamilton looks with those high cheekbones, hasn't it?
Hasn't he? Yeah.
Well, it's been there all those years,
Yes.
and we didn't know about it.
No, we didn't know about it.
Tragically, grandfather Frank died when he was only 54 in 1913. At this stage, his two older sons, Eric and Sydney, were 17 and 15 years old, and Burton was only 8.
This was, at that time, an absolute catastrophe to the family. I don't think my grandfather had left a proper will, so the estate was managed by the executor trustee company, who looked after the vineyards and the winery.
When the First World War broke out the following year, Eric signed up for the army and went to Gallipoli, and Sid signed up as a seaman on a windjammer and sailed to England.
My father was sent to St Peter's College for his education, and I have no doubt that was an excellent education, but the problem was the school fees were paid for out of his shareholding. So right from the word go, my father had less shares in the company than he would have otherwise had.
Yes, it hasn't changed at all. The old fountain, well, look at that. Let's have a try.
Burton was diligent in his studies and excelled in the classics and athletics. As soon as the war ended, Eric returned to run the company in 1919, joining Sid, who by then assumed the role of winemaker. Burton's position was different because he was so much younger. With his father dead, Burton increasingly came under the influence of his mother's brother, his uncle Bert Ailoffe, after whom he'd been named.
Well, I think Dad went bush because his father died when he was very young, and his uncle, Uncle Bert Ailoffe, convinced him he should go droving up in the middle of Australia.
He became a father figure who would weave a spell over Burton, leading him to an early life of adventure and self-discovery. Uncle Bert Ailoffe was many things: a pastoralist, a gambler, a dealer in stock and properties, an overall larger-than-life generous character. And he had properties throughout the country. It seems that with his two older brothers concentrating on the winery business, Burton decided to follow his uncle's lead. He'd had enough of study. He didn't want a regular job. He wanted a life of adventure. And I'm following in his footsteps. First stop, Leg, on the west coast of South Australia. I've never been this way before, but I hear that it's spectacular. Nowhere else. That's not Leg Station. Maybe it's on the way. Hopefully not too far. One of his uncle's properties was Leg Station on the west coast of the Eyre Peninsula. I think Burton would have been extremely impressed by this absolutely spectacular scenery, which he wouldn't have seen the likes of before as a 17-year-old. It was very, very dramatic. Leag Station. This is the place my dad came to in 1921 to work as a station hand. I've never been this far from Adelaide. It's another world to me, so unfamiliar, and yet it was his world for 2 years. I'm thinking he must have fallen in love with it. The comradeship, the country, the open air, the physical life. G'day. Well, this is beautiful sheep country, John. Wide open spaces. What was the country like in my father's day in the 1920s?
It was sheep all over it.
Was there? Yeah. Well, what are you doing with these sheep today, Peter?
Brought them into tailing today.
Right. How do you muster the sheep these days?
Usually motorbikes, bus, depends on country a bit.
When I was doing that, I was thinking that I was in Burton's shoes as a 17-year-old when he arrived for his first job. And of course, he'd had no experience in herding sheep in this way, so it would have been very new to him and quite educational. Yeah, what do you think of that? Seems to have a nice crimp to it, doesn't it? Yeah. Again, would that be 3A? Would it? The same, yeah.
Welcome to Leag, Richard.
Thanks, Mary. It's lovely to be here. Yeah. I've been really looking forward to coming here. I'm calling on John's wife, Mary Reynolds, to find out a bit of the history.
I found this, Richard.
Oh, fantastic.
And I think this will be of some help with your inquiries about... Yes. So you said your father lived and worked at Leag, and that would be, we found this in this book, J.B. Ailiff lived at Leag with his wife Laura. That's right. Is that correct?
Yep. Leag was established in the 1880s by William Gunn.
Leag.
There we go.
Well, it's a beautiful barn, this building.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
This is where he must have decided he wanted to be a sheep farmer, and he never said a word to us about it. I think there are always regrets when your parents and your grandparents die. You always think, oh, gee, I wished I asked Dad this. So we all regret that, and maybe this is my way of making some sort of amends for not having asked enough questions. I feel closer to him because of this visit. Bruce, can you tell us a bit about this old diary from 1920 that you found?
Yes, well, I had a look and I found some references to Leag. One of the brothers that owned the place, grandfather and his brother, they went down and bought some rams from Leag, so he would have been working with rams, like stud rams as well. Yeah.
Tell me what would have life been like for somebody like young Bert, a 17-year-old station hand?
Well, it would have been pretty hard. You know, it was all horses and physical work. You know, there'd be stone walls to repair as well as putting up new wire fences.
Right. Yep.
Cutting a lot of wood for fires.
Yes. Yeah.
And their posts. You know, they cut their own hind posts.
Oh, did they? Yeah. After a couple of years at Leag, he got itchy feet. Adventure was calling again. Burton couldn't ignore it. He headed north, and I'm following in his footsteps again. A ticket to Oenovidéo, thanks.
All aboard.
Ah, Dr. Hamilton, I presume. Yeah, I'm glad to see you got a ticket. Welcome aboard the Afghan Express.
Thank you. His means of travel would be very slow, but quite romantic. This is the train he would have travelled on. It might even be the same very carriage. I think he came here because there was a sense of adventure. These journeys have, where I'm following in his footsteps, have helped me understand his experiences and how they enriched his life. And of course, those experiences are now enriching my life. And then you can see the hawks and the eagles soaring, looking down for prey. In those days, the journey would have taken him north through the Flinders Ranges. I think what would have been going on in my father's mind was that this was an exciting journey, not having seen such spectacular and rugged country as he'd seen before. He travelled right to the end of the line at Oenovidéo. Oenovidéo was a busy jumping off point for all travel in the South Australian outback, as well as north to Alice Springs and beyond. All supplies for the outback stations came through the Oenovidéo line, as did the wool bales which they sent south. Burton was headed for a cattle station named Todmorden, just down the road, well, just 100 miles down the road. And in those days, the only way to get there was...
Crystal, come on, pull the right-hand rein.
Actually, I'll tell you, the reins are not quite right, Rick.
Yeah, pull the right-hand rein, that's it, Crystal.
This is a very rocky start for Crystal and I. Ah, now I've got the hang of it.
They probably walked at about 3 miles an hour. Why did he go up to Todmorden?
Well, look, he was a young man. He was 22 or thereabouts, and he wanted to get experience. He wanted adventure, and I think particularly experience in animal husbandry. Look,
well, I can relate to that. All I've ever wanted to do is work with animals.
Come on, hush, Crystal, hush, 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 hush. Good girl, hush, hush. Good, you. It seems a bit of my dad's knack with animals has rubbed off. Oh, that was terrific. And Crystal and I are now good mates. Well done. Well done. Crystal? Camels were still an important part of outback life in the 20s. Back in 1866, Thomas Elder imported 120 camels from Karachi, along with a number of camel drivers, and set up a breeding station at Beltana. They were called Afghans, although they originally came from India, and the name stuck. Pretty soon, camel trains became a familiar part of the outback scene, moving goods to and from the outlying runs. The trek from Oenovidéo to Todmorden would have taken my father at least a week. I have to admit, I didn't ride all the way on the camel, much as I enjoyed the view swaying along the camel's back. Anyway, while we're in this neck of the woods, let's have a look around. There's no question that out here one feels much closer to the spiritual side of things, and especially here in the painted desert. Even in the desert there's water, if you know where to find it, courtesy of the Great Artesian Basin. The water I'm drinking has travelled underground from northern Queensland and is a mere 2 million years old. Todmorden, 100 miles from Oenovidéo. And having driven through the Mulga country in the outback, this is a most remarkable place. When you arrive, you do have this sense of arriving somewhere, like a great chateau in Bordeaux. It's like an oasis. This is a special place. Working here would have been an interesting experience for Burton. It was in many ways a model station. I think that the time that my father spent at Todmorden certainly changed his life. I think he learnt to understand country and to love country. And it also taught him how to almost live from the ground. The accommodation arrangements for a station hand like Burton would have been very basic, despite the comforts in the homestead. He was a station hand, so he had to fend for himself and live with very little.
Here I am, boys. Hello, everybody. This is what we've been waiting for, some food. There we are, Douglas.
This is country hospitality at its finest. It's a tradition here every night at tea time. A good old-fashioned roast beef, grown just here. And of course, I brought the wine.
Great to be at Todmorden, I'd say.
Hi, Doug.
Oh, good day, Richard.
How you going?
Yeah, not too bad.
Have a seat. Yeah. Doug, can you tell us what life was like at Todmorden in the early 1920s when my father, Burton Hamilton, was a station hand here?
Oh, he would have had an interesting time. It would have been a hard life. It would have been a lonely life. There wouldn't have been many dancing girls.
Was there any entertainment?
Oh, well, I suppose they would have went to the Transcontinental Hotel at Oenovidéo.
Yeah, right.
And they would have had a bit of a frolic there every now and again.
What would have his life as a station hand entail on a day-to-day basis?
I would have thought he would have spent many nights out under the stars, camped in a swag, and then through the day, plenty of hard work from sunrise to sunset, mustering and working cattle. Part of the process also would have been drafting off any marketable cattle, and they would have done that on horseback. They would have made up a trucker mob, and then they would have walked those cattle to the railhead at Oenovidéo. They would have loaded the cattle on the old steam train, and then they would have, old Joe would have said, well, righto, you got to go back up to Aliumba or up along the Coonawarra Creek or whatever. Get another lot of fats, because, I've got bills to pay. And it would have been busy like today, but it was in a different context.
Yeah, a bit more water. Start kneading it there.
Well, I can
Salt goes a long way.
I can feel it's coming together.
Yep. No, it's looking good.
Yep. I remember when I was a small boy when we used to go down to McLaren Vale. It's coming together quite nicely. Dad would make some damper and he'd show me how to do it, but I'd sort of forgotten the details.
Bring the pot over and I'll put it down and just yep. And there.
Okay. Well,
right, just scoop. Yep, that's right. Just scoop a few up. Yeah, that's probably enough.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Not bad for a new chum.
No, you've done a pretty good job.
Burton worked here for a few years until once again he felt the call of adventure, the need to move on. So, go east, young man. The outback was a big place in those days, and my dad would have covered a lot of it. It's a different world, and I can see how it would have drawn him in. There's a hypnotic quality. It's salt. It goes as far as the eye can see. You're just a dot on the horizon here. You certainly feel your insignificance in this vast, empty landscape. There's a stillness, and you're alone with your thoughts. I passed through a ghost town. It was eerie. The whole town was still there, deserted, but you could almost hear the people's voices. Families would have moved up here, full of hope. All come to nothing, all wasted. The whole town was still here, deserted. High hopes and broken dreams.
Welcome to Albury.
Two of my brothers, David and Chris, have come over from Adelaide to join me, so we have a bit of a family reunion. So now we are three.
We as a family are a very close family, and particularly we three brothers are particularly close. So it's not often, I think, that brothers of a certain age can get together, yes, when they're young, of course, but when they're adults at our age, when their children are grown up, and spend time together with each other, talking about those old times.
And this is where our father came to. It's Elm Park, and it was Uncle Bert's main property, where he was based, in fact, in the middle of good sheep and cattle country.
Thank you so much. I'm Richard Hamilton. You must be Celeste.
I am Celeste.
And you're Graham.
Celeste Soden is the current owner, and she's quite a character.
Chris hiding there.
In its day, Elm Park was a hive of activity, with 70 station hands and staff running the homestead, and 3,000 hectares of prime sheep country. Uncle Bert was living the good life. Burton felt he'd come home.
Well, this is an interesting old building here, Celeste.
Very interesting, Richard. Indeed. Of course, the horse was the mode of transport, not only on a property like this, but right throughout this time that we're talking about.
So I suppose this is where my great-uncle Bert Ailiff would have lived, and my father Burton would have stayed here as well. Would that be?
Well, absolutely. You only have to look at it. It was Federation painted, bright red, green and cream, and fireplaces in every room.
Oh, really?
Because that was the heating.
Yes.
Not modern like today.
Because it would have been pretty chilly in winter
Well,
time.
and of course very high ceilings. So of course it was cold. There are 8 bedrooms in the homestead, 8 bedrooms. You could actually come and stay and leave a note on the sugar bin and say, you know, thanks for the holiday. No one would know. This wonderful tree, this marvellous tree here, which of course is an elm, and Elm Park is named after it. There were elms all the way down the drive in the olden days.
But now I began to find out things I had no idea about, things that shocked me. This was where the adventure was to end for Burton. The dream was to shatter, and Dad never told us a thing about it. On Uncle Bert's recommendation, he inspected a nearby sheep property called Stony Ridges.
Well, this was Dad's property.
What a wonderful aspect.
It was 1927. There were good rains that year, and the property was looking its best. To the young man about to realise his dream, the prospect must have seemed very inviting. Burton took the plunge. He borrowed money against his remaining shares in Hamilton's Yule Vineyards, and with the confidence of youth, took out a mortgage on Stony Ridges.
I've always had feelings of significant emotion in coming back to Albury, and this is the first time I have been to Stony Ridges and actually seen the old homestead where he lived.
Let's have a look at the wool shed and the shearing shed.
So it has been a very, very emotional experience for me. And of course to come with my 2 brothers. Well, this is where Dad would have been in the 1920s.
Absolutely.
No doubt he learnt to shear here. I wonder if he did any shearing.
Oh, I think he would have done plenty of shearing. Let's go in and have a look around. Crikey, it's a pretty authentic old wool shed. And look, it says that it was constructed in 1891. Yeah. Dad wasn't a famous man. You won't find him in any encyclopedia or any who's who. But people used to say to me when I was a small boy, oh, Bert Hamilton, he's true blue, isn't he?
And he's a gentleman, they would use.
And a gentleman. And a gentleman. And whenever he met a lady, he would take off his hat.
And Mum, throughout, my years living at home, used to say that she loved him so much and that she loved him the first time she saw him.
It was really almost, I would say, a perfect marriage.
A very natural man, that's right, yes.
Bloody good chap and a damn good dad. And somebody worth making a film about. Yep.
He wrote wonderful love letters to our mother. They were absolutely beautiful, and she kept them for her whole life. In fact, when she died, we found all of these letters folded up in a box in the bottom of the wardrobe.
I think you are the sweetest and loveliest girl I have ever imagined, for our love is a gift straight from the gods. I am longing for you to be with me, my darling, and it gives me great heartache to think that we may not be able to have each other unless the markets improve considerably. I am very worried as to how on earth it will be possible to make a living for us.
These intimate letters are giving me an insight into my father's dire situation and his concern for being able to provide for Guida and future family. Of course, he wasn't the first sheep farmer to have bought land with a promise of good wool prices, only to have his hopes crushed by drought. And just as storm clouds were gathering on the horizon.
1929, the financial house of cards collapses, and the overinflated stock market plunges into a Great Depression. A financial panic grips the world.
The Great Depression had started. Suddenly, people with bank loans couldn't repay their mortgages. The government brought in the Dog Act in an attempt to stave off mass foreclosures. The banks allowed families the sum of £10 a month to live on. It was very hard times. There was a lot of misery and hardship. Well, I'm thinking Dad would have been in the same situation. I've been to the sheep sale today, having
some sheep of my own for sale. Naturally enough, the market was very depressed, and the sheep made about 4 or 5 per head less than I expected.
And this is what I've found. With the Great Depression, Wool prices fell from 9 shillings to 9 pence a pound. That's a 90% fall in prices. I never knew this before. I really had no idea that it could have been as bad as that. He was a product of his times. He'd taken out a big loan to buy a property, to carve a future as a sheep grower, and then he got hit by the depression. The markets fell. A bale of wool collapsed in price by about 90%. And that sort of sealed his future there. He wouldn't have been able to make the repayments on his property with that sort of return.
You have no idea how cut up I was about leaving old stony ridges. I was near to shedding a tear as one could be.
This is amazing that he got into trouble so quickly that the bank was repossessing the land within the year. Here is a printout of the mortgage on my father's property. Goodness me, he sold it in 1930 already. I'm surprised he found somebody to buy it. I was even more surprised when I saw who he sold it to. It was Bert Ailiff, his uncle. He must have seen that he was in trouble and bought him out.
It annoys me just as much to think of what I missed through my folly in clearing off to a howling wilderness, thus destroying my financial position.
This was the end of the dream, a life of independence on the land that was over. He'd spent his inheritance. From now on, he'd be forced to work for wages in jobs that weren't really of his choosing. But there was a sweetness in all that gloom, courtesy of Uncle Bert. Burton married the girl of his dreams, 18-year-old Guy de Mott. They were wed at St Matthew's Church, Albury, on June the 22nd, 1932.
Mum and Dad met because Uncle Bert belonged to the Albury Club, and one night he invited Dad to go along with him, and they met my grandfather there, and my grandfather invited them both up to the home, Murray Bluffs. And at that time, Auntie Thalia, who was a little bit older than my mother, and Dad invited her out. And my mother said that she just couldn't wait for her to come home so she could find out what Dad was like.
What did he do? He's a crazy...
And I think Auntie Thalia just said, well, you could go out with him. So that's where it all started.
Oh, if you like him so much, maybe you should give it a try.
Guida's father, Hamilton Charnock Mott, was a significant figure in the town. The Border Mail was widely acknowledged as the best regional daily newspaper in Australia, receiving many awards for its independent, relevant coverage, with a history going back to the beginning of the century. It's wonderful to be back here after all these years, David. It certainly takes me back. David has fond memories of his grandparents and the holidays he spent as a child at the stylish Murray Bluffs homestead, overlooking the township. Interesting that the front entrance is upstairs, isn't it?
Well, here we are, brothers. This is the front entrance to Murray Bluffs, along with the main hall. And here is the sitting room.
The Mott family were very gregarious and they were always very pleased to see us.
This here, I think, was Reen's room in the old days.
My mother and father used to send us to Albury in the early days after Christmas, and we would spend late December, New Year's Day and all of January in Albury. And we spent really a delightful time. That was Fleur and I, my older sister, in the summertime, swimming down at Nuriel Park on the river, in the River Murray, and doing all sorts of activities. I have very, very close feelings to Albury, the city, and of course, naturally, to my Albury heritage.
Despite Burton's misfortune and Guida coming from a well-to-do family, her heart was with Burton and would remain so for the rest of their lives. As soon as they were married, Burton left Stony Ridges and the couple moved to Victoria, where Burton managed a property near Camperdown. This was where their first child, my sister Fleur, was born.
Mum and Dad had a lot of love and respect for each other. They were really very happy. And I don't think I ever heard a crossword between them, really. Look, we had a really happy childhood.
In 1935, they moved again to Kyneton, still in Victoria. My brother David was born that year. Other children followed.
I can remember the house quite well. They lived at 7 Powlett Street, Kyneton. This was a weatherboard house, and I can particularly remember my father holding me when I awoke with a very severe earache, and either he or my mother were comforting me, and one or other of them was putting eardrops into my ear. I can remember a little bit about leaving Kyneton. I can remember Dad packing up the goods into wooden packing cases, and I can then remember them at Yule Vineyards when we went to stay with my grandmother.
Finally, just before the war, Burton decided to bring Guida and the children home to Adelaide. Hamilton's Yule Winery was thriving at this stage under the stewardship of Eric and Sid. No doubt Burton hoped that there would be a place for him too. Burton's mother, the mater, made them welcome at the family home here at Yule. And at the winery, Eric and Sid gave Burton a job as the maltster, in charge of fermenting the mash for grain spirit used in whiskey, gin and brandy.
Dad's job was a very manual job. He was hands-on. He spent his time running the whole plant, and that meant climbing ladders to allow the grain to come down to be winnowed, then to be crushed, and then to go into a large cooking tank.
Meanwhile, in 1941, Burton and Guida had bought a house in Brighton. This is where my sister Dimpy was born.
My parents were very different, and Mum was much stronger. Dad was softer, quite reassuring, but very firm. But he would always put me to bed at night, and I think I wanted him to. And if I ever woke in the night, well, it was he who I called for.
3 years later, Hugh was born, and not long after, I came along. About this time, we moved to our Kearney Lee at Seacliff. Judy Mann grew up across the road from our house. The Manns were long-time neighbours and became family friends.
We were very close in age, and he used to play with me most days. When we were playing together in the sandpit at my place, and I hit you.
You did, that's right, yeah.
And he was heading home, looking sad. My mother spotted him, and she said, "Richard, are you okay?" And he said, "Mrs. Mann, Jonah's not being nice to me." And my mother said, "Well, Richard, if she's not nice to you, if she hits you, hit her back." And he was flabbergasted.
And of course, I wouldn't retaliate.
You wouldn't retaliate, no. Mrs. Mann, I couldn't possibly hit a girl. And I think that said so much about Richard and the family. I'm sure that Richard got his absolute gentlemanly manner from his father.
This was to be the family home for the next 46 years. Here my brother Chris was born. Alkirnie means beautiful sunset. In 1947, the year of my birth in fact, Burton took what was to be a significant step. He bought a vineyard, and the vineyard was located in McLaren Vale. This purchase by Burton was the first by Hamilton in this region. It's called the Hut Block because it had the picker's hut on it, where they lived during the season when they were working down here, and the old hut is still here. Dad would come down here every weekend. We'd often come with him. We'd have tea and lunch in here. We had an old Primus just like this. Dad would sit and talk with his vineyard manager, a World War II vet, and they'd drink Bushman's tea made with condensed milk.
On these visits to McLaren Vale, Dad taught me how to care about vines, so I learned about grape picking, pruning, and rod tying.
I even learned to drive the old grey Ferguson tractor. Those visits with Dad to the Hut Block were my real introduction to vineyards and vineyard life in McLaren Vale, and it was terribly significant for me, although I didn't realise it at the time.
This vineyard is now the cornerstone of Richard Hamilton wines. It's where Centurion is grown, and it's all thanks to my father Burton, who went out to McLaren Vale to buy a historic vineyard in 1947.
Over the years, Burton acquired other blocks, all in McLaren Vale or Willunga. There was the Church Block vineyard, located next to the old Bethany Church, established in 1854. The old graveyard is still there. The Willunga block contained a real treasure, 2 acres of very old Grenache, planted in 1947. They're bush vines. You hardly ever see them these days. There's no trellising, and all the vineyard work has to be done by hand. In fact, when I acquired this particular vineyard many years later, I called it after my father, and today it's the source of our iconic Burton's Vineyard Grenache.
Dad was very fond of a number of grape varieties. He really appreciated the flavour of grapes, and he had enormous faith in the quality of McLaren Vale.
Meanwhile, back at his day job at Hamilton's winery, Burton was given a new role in 1948, which took him out of the distillery. He was moved into the laboratory, where he assisted Hamilton's talented French winemaker, Maurice Hou, who had arrived a couple of years earlier. Burton really enjoyed working with Maurice, and he learned the many important winemaking skills. I'd join them during the school holidays. However, in the late 50s, he was taken out of the lab and made into a travelling salesman. This wasn't a welcome change for Bert at all. Before his marriage, he'd written to Guida from Stony Ridges.
It looks as though I'd be better off in the country, as I'm not suited to be a wine traveller, either by temperament or training.
But it was not in Burton's nature to complain. He took on the job and made the most of it. Meanwhile, the idea of starting my own winery had been germinating in my head for some time, probably ever since those early days. Deep down, I felt that I wanted the Hamilton name to continue. I was studying medicine, and I made the decision as I was graduating that I'd like to lead a double life, as it were. No, not as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as a doctor and a winemaker.
I think Dad was so very pleased when Richard wanted to start the winery. It was something that he had always wanted to do himself, but the opportunity didn't ever seem to arise for him. Look, he became indispensable for Richard. He managed the winery. He gave Richard a block of land to build the winery on, and he also gave Richard his grapes to produce the wine.
His years of experience at Hamilton's Yule was simply invaluable, and he was able to temper my youthful enthusiasm with reality and wisdom. My first vintage was in 1972. Dad had just retired from Hamilton's and he really got involved. He was in his 68th year. This was the beginning of an extraordinary 20-year wine odyssey, the journey of Burton Hamilton managing all aspects of the winery. He did everything: crushing, fermentation, pressing, barrel work, preparation for bottling.
He regarded it as his own winery, although it was mine, but he felt that it was his as well. Undoubtedly, it happened because of Dad.
This is the farm block which I bought in 1977 after the McLaren Vale winery had been going for about 5 years. My father selected this for me. He spotted it for sale in 1977.
Rightio, ladies and gentlemen, let's start this auction now. Who's got 50,000 to kick us away? Is there 50? Should be 50 there. Yes, sir. Thank you. At 50. Looking for another $5,000. At 50. At 50 in the middle against you, 55. At 55 on the left against the starter. At $55,000.
Well, we were at the auction and the price was going up in leaps and bounds.
Back with the starter at 60. Now at $60,000. 65. Thank you, sir. Over to my right. At 65. 70. At $70,000 now against you all. At $70,000. 72 now. Fresh blood at the left. 72,000 now. At 72,000 there. 76. At $76,000 there.
And I froze, never having purchased anything at auction before and not having arranged finance.
Now 78. Now 78 on my left. At 78,000, I'll give it the 3 calls. At 78,000 going once. At $78,000 twice. Is there anyone else?
Dad said to me, "Richard, you've got to buy it," and he grabbed my hand and put it up in the air at 80,000.
Are you all done? Is that a bid? Yep, thank you, sir. That's $80,000 now. At $80,000 against you all, I'll give it the 3 calls. At 80,000 going once. 80,000 going twice. Anyone else at $80,000? Sold. Well done.
And now this vineyard is the home of Richard Hamilton's winery and Leconfield wines. There's no question that my father really came into his own during those years when he was running the winery. I think that finally, after all those years, he felt that life was an adventure again. He was in his element. It was almost like he had his sheep farm back, without the drought and the Great Depression. So, the winery kept him going for more than 20 years, and he enjoyed every minute of it, doing it unstintingly for me, his son, and for the Hamilton wine line.
So I think we can undoubtedly say that without Burton, the wine line would have stopped.
And on a sweet note, almost every day on his way home, Burton would pick a bucket of roses from the farm block vineyard where he had a little rose garden. These were for my mother to brighten up the home. And that's why we named our rosé Guider's Rosé in her memory.
Well, I think Burton would be looking down upon me, and I think that he would be pouring himself a glass of McLaren Vale Shiraz and looking at the colour, sniffing it and having a sip and saying cheers. That's my boy.
Hello, son.